G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle. Where do I begin with this topic? I guess I should probably explain the perfectly cromulent meaning behind the video. Well, I'm a massive fan of old school Warhammer. I started in the early 1990s, and that nostalgia for the tone of that era, it appeals to me more than what is often produced today. I have incredibly fond memories from that time period, and one in particular, and it was my local store fantasy introduction table around 99-2000. Let me paint the scene for you. 4x4 table, green flock mat adhered onto MDF boards. It had two little plastic hills, also flocked. There were two armies on the board, orcs on one side led by Grimgor himself, with a unit of white metal black orcs that weighed a ton, a unit of boys, a unit of arrow boys, and a goblin bolt chucker, and I think a unit of boar boys. Across from that, there was an undead army. It was led by Heinrich Kemmler, the Lichmaster, and had a unit of zombies, a unit of black knights, a white king banner, had a unit of skeletons, and of course the infamous black coach. And I wanted to copy this table with a slightly modern update, as many of these units are hard to come by these days. So I also wanted to give some of the other options to the armies for generals, make it bigger, make it better. And to that end, I started to look around for files, like STLs, 3D STLs, because some models are just so hard to get a hold of. And I found 3D STLs for Grom the Paunch, Skarsnik and Gobbler, and Azag the Slaughterer. And yeah, I know you can technically get Skarsnik and Gobbler today, but the scale is a bit balked. There are better STLs out there. And of course, Azag the Slaughterer on his Wyvern Skullcrusher, which is what I really wanted because I thought that would make an awesome centerpiece model, named character on the other side of the table. And on the other hand, for the vampires, I dug out a certain old metal vampire and I have plans to convert it using modern plastics. And I also managed to scoop up an original unpainted Melchior on Abyssal Terror. Beautiful model. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I've struggled finding these units, but I'm getting there slowly. Now, what does that have to do with today's video, you're probably asking? Well, okay. I started to look up the various incarnations of these miniatures and compare them for scale because I was trying to decide what I want to do with them. How do I modernize them and convert some of the, old white metal miniatures that just don't look too good or work too well on the table. They're too brittle, maybe they're too hard to get a hold of, okay? And it turns out Embiggening models, it goes back a long way. Heinrich Kemmler, for example, is one of my favourite ever models. Just got a really big nostalgia point for it. And I have a fine cast one and a recast one, and I'm holding out hope for a metal one still, because something about white metal just screams elite unit to me. And Heinrich was actually the first ever special character in all of Warhammer, 40k, you name it. And he dated right back to this expansion, this campaign called Terror of the Lichmaster, right? And it was a campaign in 2nd edition Warhammer Fantasy Battles. This was back in 86. This is before I was even born. And the model you all know and love, I dare you not to say it, is actually from a relatively recent release. It's actually from 1999. Yes, it was a brand new model when it was actually on the table at my Games Workshop and I was using it. Bad Gandalf, therefore, was one of the first models to feature Embiggening. In his case, it was a blessing, as the old model was fine for the time, but hugely benefited from the changes that scale and new sculpting brought him. Another example is one I already mentioned, but cannot get a hold of legitimately, which is Azag the Slaughterer. His original white metal model came out in 1997, and it used the same dragon/wyvern model that everyone else used for their warlords. The forest dragon was the same, all they did. Games Workshop essentially excelled at recycling miniatures back then. They just added different bits into the box, like, oh, you can put a head onto the side of this one, now it's a Chaos Dragon, or give it antler horns, now it's a Forest Dragon. Like, yeah, it was the same model. And he was actually updated to a proper Wyvern and a nice new miniature back in 2009. And he benefited from the Embiggening greatly because his old model was trash. Now, another mini who has gone through incarnation after incarnation is Archaeon the Ever-Chosen. His original Champions of Chaos era model was basically a glorified Chaos Knight. Standard size horse, standard size base. Very nicely sculpted white metal horse, of course, but with 90s era demon sword. Then we got 2002's Warriors of Chaos release with the new and improved Big Bad, the ultimate ever chosen in my opinion. Again, sculpting in a larger scale and improving on the old model in basically every single way. Size actually allowed the character to breathe a little bit, and it stood out in the battlefield. That's the general, that's the boss, clearly. He's unique. Then something happened. At some point, Games Workshop went too far, and I could talk about rescaling Marines in 40k, for example, and the arguments for true scale, if it's easier to paint or it has more detail, but that's outside of the scope of this video. I want to talk about what I observed, and I think the best thing to talk about here is actually Warhammer Fantasy battles. So, my theory goes back to 7th edition Warhammer Fantasy and to Chaos Demons. I place the blame squarely at the many feet of the Soul Grinder. You see, in 40k it was a big model. It was designed in Defiler form to be like other tanks and walkers to stroll around the battlefield and wreck things. It was a vehicle and it didn't need a base. However, this model was being shoehorned into Warhammer Fantasy battles and it needed to go on a base for that game. On a 40k table, you can afford to have these vast scale differences because it doesn't really matter. It's a skirmish game, it's a disambiguation there. But in Warhammer Fantasy, movement and turning is heavily based on unit size and base size. Artillery such as great cannons trace direct line of shot for the bouncing shot. Therefore, the monster has to have a base that is correct. And in the case of the Soul Grinder, the base it was on was larger than the base of most infantry units. The entire movement tray is smaller than the base of that model. So it created a new problem. With this one decision, Games Workshop wrote a new and unwritten rule. And that rule was that kits needed to become bigger to match this one. Now, I don't dislike these kits, in fact I adore many of them, but the rule of scale had suddenly changed and nobody realised it. If you follow the progression through Warhammer Fantasy from this time onwards, you suddenly had units like the Necrosphinx, War Sphinx, Stonehorn, Cauldron of Blood or Shrine of Cain, the Luminarch of Hysh, Celestial Engine, Volkmar's War Shrine, Chaos War Shrine, Mutalith Vortex Beast, Slaughter Brute, Coven Throne, Mortis Engine, and of course the giant Arachnarok Spider. And there's more examples than this. Existing monsters, they also got bigger too, going from 60mm square bases, in the case of the old dragons, to twice that size or even giant 100 by 150mm bases. What would have once been a cavalry unit was now the size of what would have been a special mount or special character. So take the Demigryph Knights for example, they're the same size as that Melchior on Abyssal Terror white metal miniature. There was the Hydra Charybdis, the Flamespire / Frostheart Phoenix, the Terrorgeist or Zombie Dragon, Karl Franz or Empire General on Griffin, and any dragon you can think of which made it to plastic. They all got twice or even 4 times the size of what they were. These miniatures weren't so miniature, and it did have a noticeable effect on gameplay. Taking something that large and moving it around the battlefield is also kind of hard physically. They were often ridiculously huge and had parts sticking out in every single direction, just begging to be toppled. I think part of the problem was that many of the kits were being reimagined for demons, which had to look big and imposing for 40k, which meant that when they were used in Warhammer Fantasy, it made everything feel a bit small and dated in the rest of the game. The Demon Prince, for example, when it went from a white metal model in a blister pack to a giant plastic kit at that time, it was larger than the greater demons around it, and it was a clear example of this. Another example might be something like Khorne Juggernauts. So when translating this back to fantasy, it goes from a knight on a warhorse, seeing that old white metal demon prince at almost eye level, to needing that same knight to now ride on at least a demigryph. This changes the tone and the feel of things. Worse, it changes the price. See, part of why fantasy died was it was, well, too expensive to break into. And controversial opinion here, and a little bit removed from the video, but do we think that had anything to do with making every second kit a giant creature that costs twice as much as the old metal version did? Irrelevant to the video, sure, but some interesting food for thought. I think where this design trend finally came to a head, of course, was the end times, and rests squarely on the shoulders of Nagash. He was this dinky old metal monstrosity of a model from the 90s, and almost forgotten. Now he was back, but he couldn't be on a 40mm base again, but more detailed. No, he couldn't be on a 60mm base, but more detailed. No, he had to be on a giant 100mm base and stand 10 inches tall. He also had his Morghasts, which were normal, monster-sized, and the Mortarks, and my theory is that this is when Games Workshop started treating everyone like an idiot. I think the conversation went a little bit like this. Hey, how will they be able to tell who's the boss? I don't know. Well, I guess the Mortarks have to be bigger than the Morghasts, so, they're in charge. Oh, okay. Well, what about Nagash? He's a tiny, dinky little model, but, he is twice the size of a regular human. He'll be too tiny, though, next to those monstrous creatures to stand out, won't he? How can we trust people to understand he's a powerful leader and a spellcaster if he's only the size of a crypt horror? Right. We better make him bigger so he stands out in the crowd. Now, this is only my guess of what happened, but I think it actually hurt the models to be that large. It doesn't give them the room to breathe necessarily, it just amplifies the spectacle. The same people who had this thought process then moved on to Nurgle, and you got the Magoth Riders. They're already bigger than any other Chaos Demon or monster yet seen, except for, say, the Plastic Bloodthirster, which came out around this time. But once more, they needed the big general to be even bigger, so you knew he was the general, so you get the gigantic Glotkin. Even the basic infantry grew large, with the Putrid Blight Kings being huge compared to Chaos Warriors and Chosen, the previous peak in large humanoids in the setting. Excluding ogres, of course. Now, I won't speak to the quality of the releases, this is what it is, but it's fascinating to note how the design philosophy which began in 7th edition Warhammer Fantasy, with the stylistic choices made in the end times, combined to kind of create the Age of Sigmar that you know today. Look at any one product line. It could be the Lord Celestin being surrounded by a tornado of magic hammers. It could be Sigvald the Magnificent going from a normal miniature on a 25mm base to a giant almost as large as the end times Archaeon on his horse. Archaeon himself has that god-awful model which is 10 times the size of his old horse. It has 3 heads devoted to 3 gods and yet is somehow less menacing than his old steed. His old steed was a demonic horse with glowing red eyes that cracked the ground where it walked with its evil energies. That is interesting. Katakros is another giant, the engineer from Prometheus. Orc wyverns, they weren't safe. They had to become the massive Maw Crusher. I mean, fuck, giants even weren't gigantic enough, they had to make a giant. I suppose how you feel about any of this will be individual to the person, but for me, it's interesting to note just how much things have changed when it comes to scale. Change is good. Change has often been great for Warhammer in all its forms, with nearly every generation of miniatures improving upon the last. But, as my parting thought, I'll leave you with the saying, sometimes less is more. I'm Mac with the Outer Circle. Let me all know what you think in the comments, and I hope to see you on the next video.